Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
But God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast, and we're continuing conversations here on this podcast that just help you learn, help you better understand the moment that we're in culturally, and then know how to think well about it and do good. And I can't imagine a better person to listen to this month as we're kind of in the middle of this political season. You've got the Democratic primaries taking place, lots of conversation around politics and policies and who to vote for and why we should think certain ways. And Justin Giboney is someone we invited to give this talk called Confronting Identity Politics. And we wanted him to talk about this because that's so much of the game today is these identity politics kind of trickery where we're told we're part of this one group and we have to think this way, we're identified that way. And sometimes that doesn't pan out well. It's not always true. It certainly creates this general way of seeing the world that doesn't get into the specifics of individual lives, of attitudes, of belief systems. And so we wanted him to talk about that challenge, to talk both about identity politics, but also about how do we move forward in that kind of space. Now, Justin has incredible experience in all of this. He's both the co-founder and the president of the AND campaign, which is a coalition of urban Christians determined to address the socio-political arena with the compassion and conviction of the gospel. Super faithful. Him and Michael Weir and others are a part of that. But together, him and Michael host another podcast I'd love to recommend you called the Church Politics Podcast. It's just great, talking about political issues. How should we think about those in the church? And let's face it, for the year ahead, that is a big conversation. And some leaders know how to have it. Others don't know what to do. So these kinds of sources, like these kinds of politics podcasts, like the Church Politics Podcast, I couldn't recommend highly enough because it allows you to at least hear other perspectives, get into the mindset of how should we think about these things. In addition to that, he's spoken at Q a couple of times, written op-eds for publications like Christianity Today and other newspapers. But what we invited him to do is help us to think beyond stereotypes today. And so listen in to Justin Giboney.
So let's confront identity politics. My grandfather, Bishop Thomas Lee Cooper, was born in Brownsville, Tennessee in January of 1929, actually just a few days after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, he was born into the Jim Crow South at a time when Tennessee was ranked 6th in lynching. During that same time, in a massive failure of American federalism, the southern states were still systematically denying African Americans the right to vote. And while I was able to go up to Vanderbilt University just up the street from here and study social policy and later law, that just wasn't an option for my grandfather. They simply weren't admitting black people into the school at that time. Now, his family would move from Tennessee to Decatur, Illinois, which is just a few hours from Chicago. In Chicago, in 1951, 4,000 white Chicagoans rioted because a black family was moving into a Cicero neighborhood. Over and over again, we see race being used as a reason, as a primary reason for exclusion and an object of hatred. When I last visited my grandfather, who was in hospice, he had 2 8x10 photos over his bed. One was of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the other was of President Barack Obama. One represented a dignified struggle, the other an achievement within that same continuing struggle. Now, my question to you is, was his connection to those two men an example of identity politics? Sure it was. Was it shallow and naive? Absolutely not. Let's think about it. Do you think that the Hebrews identified with Moses as he led them out of Egypt? Did Irish Americans celebrate JFK when he won the presidency? Of course they did, because it was inspiring and there was a practical element to it as well. One thing you should understand about the Black tradition is that we tend to tell our children that they can be anything that they want to be as long as they work 2 times harder. And kids, being as inquisitive as they are, at some point are going to want evidence of that. And so as a Black parent, I'm always looking for social proof to demonstrate that that statement is actually true. And so there's no better feeling than to see an accomplished black person be able to turn to my son and say, see, he looks like you. It's hard to explain, but just understand that it is a privilege to be able to take that type of identification for granted. Now, I say all of this to say that we can't confront identity politics until we confront what created and made identity politics necessary, namely American racism and race-based exclusion. We're not that far removed from Jim Crow, not to mention redlining and also the war on drugs, which all had devastating impacts on the black community and the black family. So given this history, given America's history and the ongoing disparities that we see, it's hard to overstate the importance of black representation in elected office. In some instances, we're just getting back to Reconstruction era levels of representation in our community. Now, the political right often talks about identity politics as if voting for someone who looks like you is a completely irrational and a purely emotional decision. But I'd have to disagree with that to some extent. Based on American history, it's actually a rational conclusion in some instances. To conclude that your interests won't be fully represented if no one making the decisions looks like you or understands your community is actually a logical deduction. It has a firm historical basis. And so if you look at it, almost every immigrant group coming over from Europe did the same thing until they were able to blend in with the majority. And obviously, black people can't blend in with the majority in that same way, right? So to say that identity politics is always irrational or it's always a bad decision isn't seeing the whole picture. We also have to realize, because it fails to acknowledge that taglines like "Make America Great Again" are actually appeals to identity politics. And those particular appeals sometimes really cleanse and don't really talk about what America's history actually looks like. So that's part of the story, but it's not the complete story, because it's a little more complicated than that. While I believe that identity politics is often a rational decision, I also understand that the analysis can't end there, because politics is tricky. And someone could have the same race and gender or class as you and not represent you in substance. And Christians always have to care about substance. Even worse, somebody could use that identity connection to lead you into a direction that separates you from your identity in Christ. And your identity in Christ always has to be important. Hopefully, many of us learned early on in life that you can't judge a book by its cover. Also, that you shouldn't stereotype people because it's not fair to them and it could mislead you. Here's one of the problems with identity politics. The truth is that we can't determine someone's character or motives from racial ontology or gender. Someone could have several layers of intersectionality and be honest and competent. Someone could have that same profile and be deceptive and incompetent. Shared identity just isn't an indicator of integrity or ability. To pretend otherwise might make for a good tribal tweet, but it's actually fictitious and dangerous. No identity group is unbroken. Second, anytime something galvanizes and drives people in the same way as identity does, I can guarantee you that some opportunist will find a way to use it to their benefit. They'll find a way to manipulate and exploit it, especially in politics. You have to watch out for that, because political tribes want to attach their values or their agenda to your identity. Because if they're able to attach their agenda to your identity, then they pretty much control all your socio-political decisions. And this is happening. This is one of the ways where identity politics can be misused. Right now, the far left is using, in some elements of it, is using identity politics to attach their values to the black and brown identity, while at the same time erasing the more centered or traditional black and brown witness from the public square. The data shows that only about a fourth of black people consider themselves to be liberal. But almost all of our federal officials, elected officials, have taken the most extreme leftward positions on social issues. How does that happen? It certainly doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. Progressive politics has designed it almost so that it is hard to have any other option. In urban America, if a minority wants to run for office, it's almost a given that they will have to espouse these very Western European secular progressive values, even if it conflicts with their faith tradition. This presents minorities with the perception of greater representation, but it's really only a partial representation, and it actually devalues our moral point of view. Let me give you an example. My good friend, Dr. Jaha Howard, is a dentist and he's an education advocate. He was running for Georgia State Senate and was doing an excellent job. Everything was good until he refused to bow on issues like abortion and the historic Christian sexual ethic. When the progressive establishment found out about that, they did all they could to smear his name in the district, to smear it on the internet, and many of his staff members and consultants ended up resigning because they feared being attached to someone with such strong Christian views, even though they knew it before and knew that he was a great and compassionate person. These things are interesting. You see, the same people who claim to be sometimes all about diversity and inclusion are actually excluding some minorities based on their religious beliefs. They talk about the civil rights movement, but today leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. William A. Jones likely wouldn't even be able to be in leadership in many progressive circles because of their biblical values. You quickly begin to understand that our cultural identity is political capital, but our core identity in Christ becomes problematic. I'll conclude with this. Christians on the political right who want to get rid of identity politics should first fight racism and support minority leaders without erasing their witness. And Christians on the political left who understand why identity politics exist must also understand its limits and how it can be misused. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that talk. And that's the exact types of talks we try to do at our Q conference. So every April, we've been doing this for 14 years, but this is the year. If you haven't been before, you have got to be in the room with us. It's April 22nd to 24th. Come join with 2,000 others to hear talks about the year ahead. We're going to be talking about this Trump dilemma. What are Christians supposed to do about this? How do we engage? What is happening in that whole space? We're going to talk about suicide. We're really trying to engage some of these difficult conversations around gender. We know that the gender and transgender conversation is one that many of us are not only having with friends, we're having with kids, and just trying to understand, how do we think well about that? And how do we engage that type of difficult conversation? In addition to that, we're going to have Justin Giboney with us and Michael Weir from the AND campaign talking about the election season. We have Eric Metaxas, who's been a pretty big advocate for Donald Trump. And we're also going to have David French, who's another Christian who's been absolutely against Trump and would be part of starting the Never Trump movement. And at the Q stage, we're going to talk about that. How can these two Christians disagree about that? Why do they disagree? Is there any room to get along on this, or is the year destined to be divided? But in addition to that, it's going to be great. We've got the executive director of Sundance Film Festival, which just wrapped up this week. And Sundance is just one of those cultural kind of iconic spaces that really is on the front edge of artists telling stories. And we're going to have a conversation with the executive director of Sundance, along with a guy named John Pretty, who leads something called the Windwriter Forum. And I'm excited about this because together we're going to have a conversation about how over many, many years they've become friends, how they do this thing where several hundred Christians come to Sundance, take in the films, interview directors, have conversations about their stories, about faith. And it's all within this space, this public square that's pluralistic, where they might not agree or believe the same things, but they're able to have productive conversations that really help move things forward. Those are the types of things happening at Q. In addition to that, we're going to have film screenings, private concerts, exciting experiences designed to help you get out in the city and this not just be a place where you're thinking a lot and you're hearing a lot, but you're actually able to talk, engage, dialogue, learn from the other people sitting around your table at dinner time or enjoying a great evening experience. So learn more about that at qideas.org/2020. And our price increases in about a week on February 13th. So take note of that. And if you've been thinking about joining us, if you haven't quite mapped out your year of what are you doing for your own learning, make Q the place. Do it now. Make plans. Join us April 22nd to 24th.